My name is Sandy Sheller, and I'm an art and family therapist. I've done a lot of work with families experiencing homelessness. I also run a family foundation, and we're committed to improving lives, particularly those lives that live in the inner city in Philadelphia. And I work on a lot of independent projects, including a train-the-trainer parenting model that's embedded in a number of homeless shelters in the city. And that's who I am. Okay. Well, my story really is that I was working as a therapist in a family homeless shelter on Broad Street. And I felt like I was really putting out fires. So many of my clients would come to me, and the entire session would be devoted on an interaction that they had with a staff member or another resident, and trying to help them not erupt into kind of a violent altercation. And at the same time, I think that there was a sense in the entire shelter that people didn't feel safe, both the residents and the staff and myself. And it seemed to be sort of escalating. And so I could never really get to do the deeper work of working with these families and these individuals on their backgrounds of trauma and their histories. Because as I said, it was always, I was sort of right there in the midst of the chaos or the crisis about to happen. And I think I read something that Sandy Bloom had written, and this is going back almost to 2004, 2005. And at some point I had the fortune to be able to contact her, and as an agency we were able to get her to come to our facility to begin training us in the sanctuary model. She came and she trained our core staff members, and then two of her associates, Joe Federero and Ruth Ann Ryan, stayed with us for about 16 to 18 weeks, I think it was, and conducted self-groups and sort of modeled for us how to roll this out. And after that time, already we could see that staff was feeling a little more supported in their roles. And we got together, I guess it was an all-morning staff meeting, and really talked about this and decided how we were going to roll it out. And from that meeting, the staff got together. We were asking questions like, you know, why do you work here? Like, we know it's not the money. We were eliciting from them their deep care and concern for these families and individuals, their sort of knowledge that something was awry or that they had had tough backgrounds, most of these families, but they didn't really have a name to put to it. And from that, we developed jointly a mission statement that we held dear to us. And it included words like, the shelter is a safe and comforting place where people can get their needs met in a holistic way and move towards self-sufficiency and empowerment. And so we used that as kind of the bedrock to develop, you know, the tools we were going to use to implement this new trauma-based model, and to really look at our policies, our procedures, you know, how we interacted with people from the moment they walked in the door to the moment they left, you know, and it could be 3-6 months, or it could be a year later when they left. And it was pretty transformational. At the beginning, when I first called upon Sandy, we had, you know, there were always these data that the Office of Supportive Housing holds. And so in our shelter in the previous year, there had been probably on an average of 2 to 3 calls per month to the police for violence within the shelter. We were transferring about 4 families per month from shelter to shelter because they didn't get along with another family member, and we were trying to like nip a big problem you know, before it started. And we actually had to protocol quite a number of families. I think it was 16 families. And that's a really serious thing that you do with great deep thought, because what that really means is that you're telling a family that they're not safe enough to their other residents and staff to live anywhere within the Office of Supportive Housing for 120 days. And they get kicked out with their children. And in many cases, they have nowhere to go. So that means that DHS, or the Child Protective Service, comes in and takes children into custody. So it's not something that you want to do lightly or easily, but it was really, the shelter was a very unsafe, violent place. Almost a year after we had brought sanctuary to the shelter, there were no transfers. There were only 2 calls to the police that year. And one of those calls was because there were some teenage boys from the neighborhood that were trying to instigate trouble with our teenagers that lived in the shelter at the Chinese takeout store across the street. And there was maybe 2 situations that we had to ask a family to leave. but those situations had to do with very serious drug and alcohol problems, and they weren't put on the street, they were put in more appropriate treatment centers. So it was a really remarkable difference. There was another situation that happened, I guess, within a month or two after we really started to roll out safety plans and community meetings and some of the tools that you use with the sanctuary model. During the weekend, there was a mildly mentally retarded housekeeper that had been one of our workers for years and years in the shelter, and he was very well liked by people. He was just a very sweet guy. He was found dead in the freight elevator over the weekend on a Sunday. And staff called the director of the shelter and said, people are getting really upset and angry about this. They're confused about this. Tempers are escalating. There's rumors spreading. Was he murdered? Am I safe? Did he commit suicide? What's happening? And so we decided we would call an emergency community meeting, and we had a phone chain, and we got all the staff to come in on a Sunday, and we held this big community meeting. And we had already established a procedure for people to know that community meetings were places that they could talk about how they were feeling, that they could talk about the situations that were bothering them and get their needs met. And so they started really talking about all of these things, and in a relatively short period of time, all the tension sort of went. And instead of the harder kind of anger and accusing kind of behaviors, people started crying, other people were hugging people were comforting people. Residents were asking staff, are you okay? Do you feel safe? And spontaneously, a group of the residents got together and said, well, what are you going to do now? We don't have a house cleaner. And they came up with this whole chart that they volunteered to do the role of the house cleaning for however long it would take for us to replace this individual. And it was pretty amazing. And so we saw that was just really a transformation. What I would say first is that I can't really take credit for this. The credit belongs to the community that I was embedded in. Because as we started to roll this out, there were dramatic changes in the way that staff got along with the residents or the families got along with each other. And what happened was that, there was a real leveling of the hierarchy. And so people were able to really communicate to each other and hear each other in a different way. And the staff was able to include the residents' opinions and perspectives when policies and rules were made. So we had established a system where in community meetings, we would have a time period, we would let the residents sort of talk about what are the things that have been going on this week, what's problematic for you. I'll share in a little bit. We'd also talk about all the good stuff that was going on, and that was equally, if not more important. But in the process of hearing what was going on for them, there was one time period that the residents brought up that they felt like they were in jail, or they felt like they were treated like little babies because we had a curfew for them. And we had curfews and we were able to communicate why we had these rules. We had curfews for very specific rules, and they had to do with the safety and well-being and the counting of the census and how rules that came down from the Office of Supportive Housing, so it wasn't just something that we had instituted. But we really heard them, that they felt like babies and they felt like they were in prison, and they said particularly in the summer when the days are longer. And so we were able from that way not to think of our rules and policies in a black and white way, but to think about it in a more complex kind of way that individualized it for them. And so we were able to change it to say on weekends the curfew can be later than during the weekday, when kids have to get up and go to school in the morning. That was one example. The other example that came was around food, because food is such a symbol of nurture. And here you're a family living in a shelter, you're a mother or a parent, and all your authority has been taken away from you. And you live in a place where people are dictating rules to you all day long and telling you what to do and what you can't do. And they felt like when they were in the kitchen cooking, and particularly making food that they knew their children would enjoy or like, it was a way of loving their kids, and that they couldn't no longer do that. And again, we were able to explain the real reasons, about safe serving and food policy, around communal living, and, like even the Philadelphia policies around food, and why they couldn't just go into the kitchen. But within that boundary, we were able to set it up so that once a month, there could be sort of an open cooking session that the residents could come along with staff and we would prepare the menu ahead of time by sending a survey around and finding out what cultural sensitive food and menus were for these people. And they could prepare food that everybody really, really enjoyed. And that time period, we would even set the table with tablecloths and flowers, and it became a very special moment. And so those were two really concrete examples. The other thing that happened is that once they really felt that it was a safe place and that they had a voice, there were resident-run groups that spontaneously formed. So for example, there were a group of women that got together and they decided they would teach each other how to knit and crochet. And they made such wonderful stuff that they then jointly decided that they were going to open up a business and try to sell this. And they actually contacted someone to, do all the business planning for them, and they chartered it, or whatever you do when you set up a business. And they started selling their products. And it was really delightful. And when they moved out of the shelter, they had this little mini business and they kept it going. And then they would kind of come back and report to us how it was going, and that was pretty special. So there were many changes like that that happened within the shelter. One of the things I remember very specifically is during one of our community meetings, there was this single father that was in the shelter raising his children. And he had been kind of withdrawn a lot and argumentative a lot and a difficult kind of a person. And you could just see softening happen with a lot of the residents, not just him. And he raises his hand at one point and he said, "Can we stop calling this a community meeting? Because every time I come to these meetings, I feel like I'm coming home. Can we call it a family meeting?" And everyone in that group that day decided we would call it a family meeting. And so when 4 o'clock came and it was time for our community meeting, they would call over the loudspeakers, "Our family meeting is about to start." So that was pretty cool. So those are some examples. What happened was, and again, it really happened in a relatively short period of time. I want to say a year and a half, maybe 2 years. We were noticed because our rates of violence were really, really different than other shelters around us. Because our ways of interacting, even with, our shelter directors' interactions, even with the management and Office of Supportive Housing, changed in terms of being able to articulate for what she needed or talk about why it was important to tweak the policy a little bit. And we were kind of invited to introduce what we were doing to the Office of Supportive Housing. Around the same time period, I started to notice that there were only a few other agencies that really were talking about trauma at that time. And I got together with a colleague of mine that was actually the clinical director at Women Against Abuse at the time. Her name was Ida Kaufman. And she was experiencing the same thing. And so what we decided to do, Ida and I formed what was called the TIN group, or the Trauma Informed Network group. Now, what was really intentionally different about this group was up until this period of time, every once in a while they'd offer trainings in trauma or trainings in sanctuary, but most of the times it would be for the clinical staff or the shelter directors. And we noticed that the people that really were on the ground most of the time were on the ground in the most vulnerable times, like overnight or the weekend, weren't trained at all. And they were the staff that was closest to the life experiences of the very people they were serving, so that they may have been once homeless themselves, or they may live in the same communities, they may have had backgrounds of trauma themselves. And that was where a lot of the retriggering was happening. So when we developed this TIN group, we decided that what we would do is we would invite all levels of staff to participate in this group for the purpose of spreading what we knew about trauma-informed services and hearing from others what worked in their agencies, what they were doing, what they'd like to do. And so we started with sort of 8 of our friends, and within a year's time, we were averaging 30 people to these meetings. And within 2 years, we were reaching over 26 agencies throughout the city and about 40 to 50 people on average. And I have to say, I think it's in its 10th or 11th year. It's still going. Ida and I are no longer in running or facilitating it, but it's still going and it's going strong. And it really gave a voice to all levels of staff and really got them really engaged. And so now we had not only discussions that we ourselves had had with the Office of Supportive Housing, but other agencies were talking to the Office of Supportive Housing. And so at some point, the pendulum tipped. And I guess Office of Supportive Housing reached out to Sanctuary Institute, to Sandy Bloom, and they started training. And so a lot of agencies in the city got trained, and the staff at the Office of Supportive Housing got trained. So it was a really a great moment. What we didn't see really happen is that we could really work effectively to change the culture of the shelter and even begin the dialogue and do a lot of healing with the adults in the shelter. We didn't always see it translated into how they parented their children. And so from that, I got together with another colleague of mine, Karen Hudson from CHOP's Homeless Health Initiative, and we developed a train-the-trainer parenting model where we teach, again, a paraprofessional working on the front lines in the shelter to run this manualized program with groups of parents in the shelters. It's about a 6-week program, and it is based on trauma-informed theory, it's based on attachment theory, and it has actually a cultural piece. So we really talk about where did the whooping come from. And it's showing really evidence of moving some of the top parental attitudes most likely to lead to abuse and neglect. And we were, I guess, put in last year's national book on child homelessness as being one of 3 promising programs. So we're going to keep going with it. As this work continued, and it seemed to me that it was not just me as an individual, as a family therapist, with X number of families per week. And it was not just me training staff within my one shelter to, branch this out, or working within the Office of Supportive Housing, but the transformation needed to happen on a larger, more macro level. And so in order to do that and affect more lives, to step into the role of a philanthropist, to step in the role of having a foundation that could support some of these programs, and even larger, not just give money, but get involved in the projects and get involved as a connector to kind of help break the silos down and connect people across the city of Philadelphia for the common purpose of improving lives and really dealing with this major issue of trauma that is at the root of so many of the problems, such as violence and poverty and incarceration and school problems and behavioral health. You could just substance abuse. You could just go on and on. It seemed a wiser thing to work from that perspective and still stay connected with the people on the ground that are doing the work. So the knowledge I have about trauma does really influence the decisions I make. When our foundation started, we would pretty much give to people that asked us little bits of money here and there. Or we didn't really have a focus. So it's made me really look at what is the focus, what am I trying to achieve, what am I trying to accomplish, and can I have my own mission and my own sort of bulleted key points of what I'm going to give to and for what reasons. And it's also made me look at projects that can be more sustainable. And that doesn't necessarily for me mean that they're projects that have large grant monies that can do that, evidence-based research, because there's so many really wonderful things on the ground that don't have the money to get to that level of evidence-based research and may even be more effective than the ones that are already the standard evidence-based. So that means looking creatively for those programs that can make major changes with little resources in a way. That if we can get embedded into the systems as they already are, if we can train those paraprofessionals, if we can change the culture of the system, not just top down, but bottom up as well, then we can get everybody galvanized to do this work and to recognize that although in the front end it may look like it's a lot more work for just the same salary, at the back end it's actually less work and it's actually more rewarding and more satisfying work. To begin to really make a broad transition in all of Philadelphia, the people that are embedded in this work really, or being trained in this work, really have to believe in it. Change doesn't really necessarily happen in a really neat, linear fashion. So somebody really has to understand that and believe that what they are doing, they can persevere with it and it will change the culture. Like we work with our individuals, we have to give a little wiggle room there as it's being practiced, as it's being rolled out, for people to make mistakes and then learn from those mistakes and pick themselves up. Again, I think it's important in the city of Philadelphia that it has to be top down and bottom up, that everyone has to be speaking the language and informed, because you can't have the people that are doing the work, doing that hard work, and the people at the top that are the policymakers and the shapers not understand what they're doing, and then sort of counterintuitively do things that undermine, not intentionally necessarily, but undermine what the work is. I'd say that unless we're all safe, none of us are safe. And people really have to get behind that and realize that what happens to someone that lives in North Philadelphia, even if you live in Rittenhouse Square, does affect you. And that has to be a message that's spread. And there has to be a leveling of the playing field so that the opportunities are more equal for all of us. Opportunities for jobs, opportunities for living wages, opportunities for education, opportunities for healing to happen. So I think there's some of the things that Philadelphia there has to be a breaking down of the silos, So many of our systems, because funding is so limited and short and fragile in a way, there's this turfdom. Like it's, I've got this money and I'm going to use it for my program, but there's so much overlap that there has to be a breaking down of the silos and a shared kind of responsibility in the work that we're doing that I'm sure if we did that really well, we would find there's enough resources for it to go around. You can be trauma-informed in any position that you have. It really doesn't matter whether you're the CEO of a company, whether you're the street collector, whether you're the food preparer, whether you're the mailman. You can be the change you want to see happen, and it is contagious, when you start to do that. I think the other thing I would like to tell people is we have to stop villainizing people that are hurting. And we have to stop responding to them in really punitive ways. Because if we really want them to heal, we have to get to know them. We have to build relationships with them for more of a long haul. And we will find if we do that, at least that's been my experience, that people are amazing. They're amazingly resilient, they're amazingly creative, they're amazingly caring when you really get to know them, and you can bring those walls down. And I think that we live in a world where it's so black and white, and there's right, there's wrong, and you do this intervention or this protocol and you're expecting this instant dramatic change. And really the change happens in relationships with people. And when we think about how we would want our city, wouldn't it be a really cool city if at any moment we could walk down the street with a smile on our face and everyone we encounter says hello and smiles back, and everyone in every neighborhood feels that they can walk in their own neighborhoods and in their own worlds and feel safe at all times. When you think about some of the resistance that you might encounter, you work with people that aren't really comfortable with emotions. They haven't ever really talked about it or learned about it. Maybe it's all too touchy-feely for them. Or maybe it's just that you ask them how they're feeling and the answer is, I'm okay, and they don't have the vocabulary for it or the kind of way in which to connect in more of a primary process way. So what I have found really gets deeply, quickly at people in a very comfortable way is to be creative with how you ask them that question. So instead of saying, how are you feeling today, to say something like, if you were a color today, what color would you be and why? If you were a ride in an amusement park, what ride would you be and why? And people delight in that, and they love answering. They can't get enough of that, and they will tell you how they're feeling and why they're feeling in those more creative questions. So that's an important thing. The other thing is that I think that we as a society are always focusing on what people do wrong, and always, as bosses and supervisors and people in charge of things are always reprimanding people when they don't do things right. But it's really much cooler, and you get much more if you focus on what people are doing right. And I know in our community meetings in the shelter, what we used to do is we would have this thing called brags, and the residents made that up. And it didn't matter whether it was a little baby that got potty trained, or it was somebody that got their housing and filled out their paperwork, or it was somebody that, got their high school diploma, or whatever it was, we would brag about them. It could even be a birthday we'd brag about. And we also had something called unsung heroes, and again, this was something the residents made up. And an unsung hero was someone that had been noticed as doing proactive positive behaviors for other people, like caring kind of behaviors, and once you start building that kind of a thing, then people want to do more of that. And you find that people they'll step over each other to try to be kind to each other instead of stepping over each other to push each other away and fight with each other. So as a result of thinking about trauma, I've been working on thinking about how it applies to other aspects of relationships, of development. And one thing that we did notice with all the work in the shelter that we did, that we could really change the culture. We could really work on healing the adults. We could work on empowering them. They'd have a lot more self-efficacy from this. But it didn't always translate into how they treated their children. And they were all being mandated to parenting classes. Most of those were behavioral, and they were do this, don't do this. And they felt like a very demeaning kinds of experiences for many of these parents. And so I got together with a colleague of mine, Karen Hudson, that works at CHOP's Homeless Health Initiative, and we developed a train-the-trainer parenting model that is based on trauma-informed theory. It's also based on attachment theory, and it has a cultural piece so that we really address and talk about where did the whooping come from and the very real cultural aspect of corporal punishment and the generation of that. And our program is not a behavioral. We never tell somebody what to do or what not to do. We're looking to have parents understand what the triggers are when they're parenting from their own backgrounds. You know, there are lots of terms for it: ghosts from the nurseries, voices from the past, shark music. And we're looking for them to be able to identify that and then learn to override that so that they can still meet their child's developmental needs for nurture and care. And so we developed this program, again, with the aspect of training a paraprofessional that works on the ground in many of these facilities to run our manualized program with parents. It's approximately 6 weeks long, and it's really shown significant promise for moving some of the top parental attitudes most likely to lead to abuse and neglect. And last year's big national book on child homelessness listed us as one of 3 promising programs, and we're continuing with it. And in our program, a couple of things that parents really, really appreciate learning about is, again, they love learning about the trauma and how their stuff that happened to them in childhood very much does affect what they do with their children. You know, many will come into our program saying, well, I was whooped, it doesn't matter. And shortly into the program, they'll realize it really has mattered. And now I can take little Johnny's perspective, feel what it might feel like to be him and not want to do that with him. So we never tell people what to do, but once they shift their perspective and their attitudes, the behaviors do change.